Hello and welcome to PocketGamer.biz's weekly news digest for the week ending the 27th of March 2015. I'm Jon Jordan. So the big news this week was Supercell announcing its 2014 financial figures. So it's one of these kind of oddities of Scandinavian countries that even though kind of companies like Supercell and like Rovio and the Swedish companies as well, even though they're not public companies, so you can't buy their stock on stock exchanges, which means companies have to release their financials every 3 months. Because they're such egalitarian societies, they're quite open about all corporate kind of dealing. So effectively, you can look up any company, its financials if they're Swedish or Finnish, and kind of basically find out what's going on. So what tends to happen with big Swedish and Finnish companies, they tend to announce their figures kind of publicly anyways, if they're a kind of public company, and that's what Supercell did this week. So I guess to no great surprise, Supercell's numbers were very good. Obviously Supercell, which is our number one game developer for 2015, has 3 massive games. It has Clash of Clans, which is the biggest free-to-play game in the world. It has Heyday, and it also has Boom Beach. So it's kind of like a triumvirate of kind of success there. So no surprise to hear that its financials for the calendar year 2014 were $1.7 billion of revenue. So that's increased 3 times since its figures for 2013. Profits had doubled, so they were $580 million. And I guess if you were kind of quibbling, you could say, well, they've kind of like tripled their sales and only doubled their profits. I think to a degree that shows how much money you have to spend kind of continuing success if you have success. So Supercell doesn't announce these figures in terms of how much money it spends on marketing or user acquisition, but it's generally reckoned that the big companies are spending between kind of 20 to 30% of all their revenue kind of coming in is being spent marketing and advertising and just gaining more users to make sure its games continue to be successful. And I guess that's kind of interesting from the larger kind of structural point of view of the industry. So you now have these very big companies like Supercell and like King and like Machine Zone and like Gung Ho in Japan, and they just generate hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and because they're spending so much money on marketing, they're effectively driving out any competitors getting into those marketing spots, because they're the most profitable companies in the world, so they can spend the most on user acquisition, so they can make sure when a high kind of value user is on Facebook or in another game, that the advert they see is for Clash of Clans or for Candy Crush or for those kind of games. So it's kind of an interesting kind of trend that is kind of, we're calling it kind of top of the charts kind of stasis. In general, it's kind of seen as a bad thing, in the sense that those top of those charts now are just kind of stuck. They've been stuck pretty much for a couple of years now. There's not really a lot of new games going in there. It's kind of an interesting question. It's kind of a question that we asked our Mavens group. So our Mavens group is a group of kind of mobile game experts, and we ask them questions every week. And the question we have out this week is the likes of Dominant by Supercell and Machine Zone and Gung Ho and King, is that kind of killing off the market? Is that killing disruption? Were those companies, because it's kind of interesting now, those companies released games in 2012 and 2013, and that just happened to be when the kind of iOS and the Android market was taking off. So to a degree, you make your own luck, but they were lucky that they kind of released these games at exactly the right time, and they were obviously skillful enough to maintain and operate those games. But it's very hard to see kind of certainly very hard to see another developer coming in and doing a Supercell in terms of launching 3 massively successful global games, because a company that now has to enter that market has to compete with Supercell. When Supercell launched Clash of Clans, there was no equivalent of Supercell. The market didn't exist. So I guess to a degree the Mavens kind of are saying it's very hard for anyone to kind of come into that market and kind of take that level of dominance. But that's not to say there aren't very valuable opportunities still for companies. So it's obviously big disruption happens in gaming a lot, because gaming is very driven by hardware. So the consensus seems to be that Apple Watch won't be a massive gaming platform, but who knows? Maybe people thought that about the iPad. And maybe a micro console, maybe an Ouya equivalent, or maybe an Apple TV, maybe an Apple Games console will come in and cause massive disruption in the market. So it's very hard to say you never have another billion-dollar company coming into the games industry, but it's generally kind of seen that the kind of smart companies now are looking at kind of niche areas. So they're kind of looking at kind of maybe more kind of this kind of mythical mid-core kind of audience, or maybe they're looking at very hardcore RPGs in China, or maybe they're looking at, this is kind of a phrase now, super casual. So maybe a game like Crossy Road is a super casual game that doesn't monetize very heavily, but it has a massive kind of audience in terms of millions of users. and maybe with video advertising, which is the kind of the hitting a sweet spot at the moment, maybe kind of companies can make millions of dollars in a different way than companies have made millions of dollars before. I guess kind of another kind of interesting point from kind of arising from the Supercell kind of financials was, I mean, Supercell is a kind of interesting company, and it kind of, the way it presents itself is very interesting. So kind of coming back to the user acquisition thing, I mean, Supercell was one of the 3 companies spending money in the Super Bowl this year. So it did a very funny and very well crafted advert for Clash of Clans using with Adam Nielsen, with Liam Nielsen pretending to be an annoyed player. And maybe Supercell are trying too hard, but someone asked them a question about how they came up with this idea of doing a Super Bowl advert. And they were just kind of in a very finished way. They were just like, oh, we were all in the sauna, and we were just kind of like talking about what we should do. And someone came up with this idea, and we all voted on it then. And we didn't really think it through. We didn't kind of run it through any number to see how much, how many users we were going to reach, and whether it would be ROI, return on investment, positive, and all that kind of stuff. We just did it, and I guess to a degree that kind of partly shows how massive Supercell is, that it doesn't really matter that it spends $10 million doing an advert for something like the Super Bowl, but equally partly it shows that Supercell is still kind of a little bit desperate to be seen as a very cool company that doesn't really work very hard and doesn't really know what it's doing, which is absolute rubbish. Clearly, to get $1.7 billion, you're laser focused on operations and how to get money off people, and obviously making good games as well. That comes as part of it. Very hard to make $1.7 billion if your games aren't very good. So that was the news for this week. Come back next week and we'll see what company is disrupting the industry and making billions of dollars then.